In this video, I'm going to talk about non-standardized transformations, a topic I think there's a lot of confusion about, and also a topic that I think students and researchers alike struggle with because they're trying to deal with a problem that doesn't actually really exist. So let's get into it. Non-standardized transformations convert raw scores into scores that have a different distribution. So they are similar to standardized transformations in that they do convert raw scores into something, but unlike standardized transformations that convert scores into something that's more interpretable, non-standardized transformations do not do so. They do not transform data into a more interpretable scale or values. In fact, they do the opposite. I would say that non-standardized transformations actually transform raw scores into something less interpretable. And to give you an example, you might have a distribution of age scores, and everyone knows what age of 26 is. If you're 26 years old or 53 years old, people understand what those scores mean. So that means you understand the scale upon which age was measured. But as soon as you apply a non-standardized transformation to a variable like age, you then get scores that are uninterpretable. Scores like 0.06. How can you be 0.06 years old? And the highest score might be something like 1.3. So that is one of the main limitations, I think, of non-standardized transformations, is that they transform the data into a meaningless scale. The reason people use non-standardized transformations is to help make distribution of scores more normally distributed. And I have hinted along the chapter thus far that one of the assumptions of many inferential statistics is that the data are relatively normally distributed. And some people think perfectly normally distributed, and they really get fooled by thinking that. So because people get data that are somewhat non-normally distributed, they might have skew of 0.5 or skew of negative 0.63. They think they have to deal with that, and they have to try to make their data more symmetric or less skewed. And so they apply a non-standardized transformation to try to make their data less skewed, more normally distributed. So I'm not a fan of non-standardized transformations. In fact, I would say that I've literally never used one in my life for the purposes of writing up a research report or a paper. First, they transform the data into less interpretable scores. I like to stay as close as possible to the scale upon which the data were measured because it's usually the most meaningful. The other reason I don't like non-standardized transformations is that they're not actually necessary to apply to satisfy this assumption of normality that people go on about. Just to foreshadow my point, as I discussed throughout the whole textbook, is that many statistical analyses can actually handle a fair amount of skew in the raw scores. And I'll even foreshadow later in this video presentation what I think skew can be at before it's a serious problem. The other reason I don't like non-standardized transformations is that often they don't actually work. So although people get very skewed data from time to time, and they want to make their data less skewed so that they can apply a statistical analysis upon those data, it doesn't actually do the job. So the two most popular non-standardized transformations that I come across are the Log10, by far the most popular I would say, and square root, somewhat less popular, for good reason. Now, to show you the ineffectiveness of these very popular transformations, let's go back to the data I showed you earlier on in the chapter that was very skewed. That was skewed data of 1.99. This is skewed data, no doubt about it. This is highly positively skewed data. And a researcher might come across this sort of data and think, I can't apply an inferential statistical analysis upon it because I can't trust any of the results I get. And a negatively skewed distribution is something like this. This is a negatively skewed distribution that I covered earlier with a long tail going to the left side. So how might applying a log-10 transformation or a square root transformation upon these data make the data more normally distributed or less skewed? So this is what I got. When I applied the log10 transformation on those skewed data of 1.9, it yes reduced skew, but it's still very skewed, 1.45. So if you believe that your statistical analysis requires normally distributed data, as in skew of what, 0? Then you are still faced with the problem of thinking that you can't analyze the data. That's not true. You can. The square root reduced it to 1.7. So the log-based transformation was more effective at reducing skew from 1.99 down to a value of 1.45, but neither transformation actually achieved the result of anything approximating skew of close-ish to 0. It's very far from 0, so it didn't actually work. And this is very typically the case. And unfortunately, students and researchers alike feel like they're stuck and they can't do anything about it. And the response is actually you can do something about this situation. I'll talk about that in the last slide. So negatively skewed data is even more vexatious when it comes to applying a non-standardized transformation. And when you apply these commonly used transformations like the log10 and the square root, it actually makes the problem worse. So with negatively skewed data, I started off with negative 1.99, and the log10 has made it increase to a skew of negative 5.82, and the square root increased it from negative 1.99 to negative 2.85. Now there are other transformations like the exponential transformation that can be more successful at reducing negative skew, and I'll probably cover that in a separate video at some point showing you which non-standardized transformations can reduce positive skew or negative skew. But overall, I don't want you to take home the message that you should be using these transformations, because first you should be able to trust in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, that whatever statistical analysis you're applying on your data, which I cover throughout the textbook, can handle fairly non-normally distributed data. And what is fairly non-normally distributed data? Well, the rule that I use throughout the textbook is an absolute skew, so negative or positive, of 2.0. If the skew is less than 2.0, there's a decent chance that the analysis you're performing on those data will produce accurate results. And kurtosis of absolute value of 9.0, less than that, you have a decent chance of being okay analyzing your raw data the way they are. Now, even if you did violate this rule of 2.0 skew and kurtosis 9.0, you still have the option of using bootstrapping as the estimation technique. Now, I mentioned this only very briefly to foreshadow other information that I provide across the chapters in the textbook, but you should not feel like you are stuck with data that you need to transform in some way. You can stay very close to the original data and use bootstrapping. Bootstrapping will work if you have skew less than 2, and it'll work if you have skew more than 2. So that is my point of view on non-standardized transformations.